And joining us now is Michael Greenberger, who is formerly the Principal Deputy Associate Attorney General at the United States Department of Justice, where he supervised work in security matters. He also is the founder and director of the Center for Health and Homeland Security at the University of Maryland, where he also teaches constitutional law at the University of Maryland School of Law. Welcome to Background Briefing, Michael Greenberger.
Thank you, Ian.
So, Michael, I wanted to get a sense of the landscape in terms of Homeland Security as we head into this, or begin this, what's going to be a very turbulent political year, one in which a number of scholars are predicting some form of civil strife or even civil war. I noticed that the former head of Homeland Security for Washington, D.C., a couple of days ago said that we are busy looking into the rearview mirror and that we're not looking at the threats that's right in front of us. How do you see the situation going forward?
Well, first of all, I'd say that there's an element of truth in that assessment, but it's not completely derived from negligence on the part of people who have these responsibilities. It's often forgotten that the people who worry about civil unrest, for example, which is what I think you are focusing on, are also worried about responding to climate crises, wildfires in California, for example, or in the East Coast, snowstorms. We had one of the major 95, the major highway going from Massachusetts to Florida, was completely blocked during a snowstorm, and people were on the road without food for 30-some hours. The people who worry about things like that are the people who are going to worry about civil unrest. And then not to mention COVID. I'm sure all over the East Coast, I'm sure it's true on the West Coast too, governors are declaring emergencies to be able, for example, to use the National Guard to supplement nursing capability in hospitals that are completely overrun by COVID. I know in Maryland, it's where I have responsibility. It's the hospitals are just completely overrun. The medical personnel are, if they don't have COVID themselves, are exhausted. The governor of Maryland declared an emergency, which allows him to alter licensing requirements. And so they're taking nursing students and training the nursing students to go into the hospitals to supplement the nursing staff. So with things like that happening all over the place, the focus on civil unrest or the worry about civil unrest, there's a tremendous distraction from it. The other thing I would say is a bit of good news, not completely good news, but I think that there are lessons learned from the January 6th event. On the one hand, I think the perpetrators thought that they were under the direction of the president and therefore were immune from any responsibility from law enforcement. And while there is criticism that not enough has been done there, the Attorney General Merrick Garland has been under criticism. There have been over 700 people in various stages through the criminal process. And it is a shock to the system, to these people, that there is criminal responsibility for this, and there's no defense that they were under orders from the then President of the United States. And the second thing is, I think, for example, the Capitol Police, the man who is now heading it, Tom Manger, is brought out of retirement. He was the police chief in one of the major jurisdictions in Northern Virginia, and then in Montgomery County, which is one of the big jurisdictions outside of Washington. I know him personally. He's absolutely first rate. He testified on January 6th about what's being done with the Capitol Police. They're very short-handed. I think he promised he would hire 680 new police personnel. But he is a tremendously responsible guy. The people who are there are being trained, and I don't think it is as likely that they would be caught off guard, for example, as they clearly were on January 6th. And finally, you will have noticed that because the capital is in the District of Columbia, and the District of Columbia is not a state, the mayor of the District of Columbia could not call out the D.C. National Guard to come to the rescue of the personnel in the Capitol building. They needed the Department of Defense to approve that. Now, in California or in Maryland, the governor can bring the National Guard out without, unless it's federalized, it's run by the governors, it's a state-run operation, and Congress passed a law that says the mayor of D.C. can bring out the National Guard, so you won't have this 3-hour wait for bringing the cavalry in to assist. So I think a lot of things have improved in terms of response, including that I think the message has gone out that it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card, and therefore some of the worries about this have disappeared. And the final thing I would say is, to me, this is reminiscent of 1933 in Germany, state by state that are controlled by Republican legislators. Voting rights are being absolutely decimated. The number of places that one can vote in Democratic-held jurisdictions are being limited. You cannot use absentee ballots. You can't vote by mail. And that's what we're seeing, this fight on Capitol Hill of getting voting rights legislation that would preempt these diminishments of the right to vote, especially in democratic jurisdictions. And if that doesn't get corrected, the kinds of things that wanted to be accomplished through taking the Capitol on January 6th may be accomplished, I use the word in quotations, peacefully, by preventing people from voting in the midterms in the next presidential election.
But to continue on from the statements from the former head of Homeland Security in Washington, D.C., he said that instead of waiting for the very last moment to effect an election, the battle's going to be back at the states. Consider the fact that if the federal government wasn't prepared for what happened on January the 6th, what are the state and local authorities going to be prepared for?
Well, my assessment, Ian, and I'm perfectly prepared to be corrected, is that the governors in the states, and I would say especially the blue state governors, I put California in that. On the East Coast, we have Republican governor in Massachusetts, Republican governor in Maryland. They are beefing up the National Guard, traditional law enforcement to prevent the kinds of things that happened on January 6th. And I know the mayor of D.C. is, now that she has authority over the National Guard and doesn't have to wait to get the authority from the Defense Department, is doing the same. And I have a high degree of confidence that you can say you're looking backwards, what have you, but that steps will be taken in the state capitals, in large cities, and in the Washington, D.C., the red flags, and there were red flags before January 6th, all the commemorative events on January 6th makes that crystal clear. The red flags were there. They were ignored. I don't think they'll be ignored this time. And so I'm more optimistic that civil unrest going in, for example, to the midterms or even the presidential election will be quelled. Now, if the right to vote is interfered with, as if the laws that are being passed in many of the red states come to fruition, the frustration over not being able to vote because there are not enough voting precincts, because there aren't absentee ballots, because there isn't voting by mail, and all the other things that were done in the 2000 election to make it easy to vote are taken away. The frustrations there could be overwhelming. But I do think people are not, governors, our mayor in D.C., are not sitting around waiting. If there is any problem, it's being distracted by having to use every resource available to handle hospital populations as a result of COVID. Crime is going up in various jurisdictions. There's distraction over dealing with other emergencies and maybe taking the eye off civil unrest.
And again, I'm speaking with Michael Greenberger, who was formerly the Principal Deputy Associate Attorney General at the United States Department of Justice, where he supervised work in security matters. He's also the founder and director of the Center for Health and Homeland Security at the University of Maryland, where he also teaches constitutional law at the University of Maryland School of Law. So when you mentioned the idea that Democrats are going to be furious if they can't vote in 2022, or if indeed the votes are overturned, which now a lot of Republican legislatures in various states are passing laws that allow them to count and certify the vote, and if they don't like it, they can change it. That kind of a response, whether in whatever degree of civil unrest that would involve, wouldn't that invite a right-wing backlash? Because it seems like the right-wing militias are far more organized, and they're certainly heavily armed, and you just have to look at the example of the plot in Michigan to kidnap Governor Whitmer.
I think that's absolutely right. First of all, who can predict the future? But I don't see Democrats being lawlessly violent in responding to whatever problems arise. There will be demonstrations, there will be protests, but as was true of the protests around the police problems in 2020, those protests were by and large, they were large, but they were peaceful. But the future in terms of whether or not people have the right to vote, or whether Democratic jurisdictions or poor jurisdictions are prevented from voting, I mean, that's something we haven't gone through. Who can predict? And by the way, all of this makes the federal voting legislation that much more important. And there's hand-to-hand combat going on in Capitol Hill right now to pass federal legislation that would preempt all these state laws that are trying to take the right to vote away. And that's a very dicey situation right now, and not enough attention is being paid to that. Of course, we're in a 50-50 situation in the Senate, and you've got Joe Manchin, who's raising a lot of problems for the Democrats. He's a Democratic senator from West Virginia, and he's not been helpful in a lot of these reform efforts. That may be a kind description of his activity, but that needs to be watched, because if they can get that federal legislation through the Senate, it's already been through, and it would go through again the House of Representatives. You could have federal legislation that would preempt these state laws that are trying to limit the right to vote.
So there was an op-ed in the New York Times a couple of days ago by former President Jimmy Carter warning that the United States is at genuine risk of civil conflict. Our great nation now teeters on the brink of a widening abyss, he wrote. Without immediate action, we are at genuine risk of civil conflict and losing our precious democracy. Americans must set aside differences and work together before it is too late. What do you make of that?
I think he's absolutely right, and it goes to my point that, as was true in Germany in 1932 and 33, the right to vote for democratic jurisdictions may be legally taken away unless they get this federal legislation through. And that means democracy as we know it. I mean, we've seen, we go back to the election of 2000, which 550 votes made the difference, but you had all the irregularities in Florida that allowed Florida to go to Bush rather than Gore. And then again in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million, but lost the election. And boy, was that ever consequential. Trump put 3 justices on the Supreme Court and these arguments that took place yesterday demonstrate the overwhelming doctrine of the conservative jurists on the court on a 6-3 vote that puts, for example, the vaccine efforts that President Biden has and Congress has enacted to make sure people get vaccinated has put that in jeopardy. So, yes, if the red states are able to limit the ability of Democratic jurisdictions to vote, and especially poor jurisdictions or jurisdictions that have predominantly young voters, what Jimmy Carter says about the future of democracy is absolutely right. And the question is if we are able to beat back these red state limitations on voting through federal legislation, will that cause the kind of disruption that we saw on January 6th? Now, my own view is the dangers are greater in the state capitals right now than they are in Washington. I think Washington is pretty well protected. As I said, the head of the National Capitol Police, you couldn't ask for a better leader for that. The mayor of D.C. now has control over the National Guard, but I worry about the state capitals. And if it may be that these the kinds of protesters we saw on January 6th, I used the word protesters in a gentle fashion. It was much worse than protesting, as President Biden said. But they will get what they want, and then the question is going to be, what will Democrats do when they're denied the right to vote, and how will they respond?
Well, just in the last minute, I mean, you mentioned Weimar Germany and the takeover of the Nazis in 1932-1933. Of course, a big part of that was the burning of the Reichstag, which was probably done, I think fairly certainly done by Hitler himself as an excuse. The storming of the Capitol on January the 6th was almost a burning of the Reichstag, obviously without fire. And since his defeat, former President Trump has gotten more and more radical and more encouraging violence. So is there any way that you can stop him? Because without him, I think a lot of the steam would go out of this movement.
Well, I on that point, I'm worried that, yes, I think Trump definitely is the principal instigator here, but it worries me very much that this is so deeply embedded in anti-democratic and possibly heavily armed forces that even without Trump, we could have similar kinds of problems. But be that as it may, yes, your analogy between the Capitol, it's not perfect, but there's a lot to be said there. And what happened in Nazi Germany are correct. As I said, I think, fortunately, we don't have a federal police force in that sense. We rely on local and state jurisdictions for law enforcement, and to the extent the National Guard plays a role. And by the way, that's a role that's largely ignored and very important. Anytime there is a major crisis within a state, the state National Guard is a principal responder. Now, bear in mind also that the state National Guard can be federalized, and that's in the vein of the things we're talking about. Who's the president? That could have big consequences. But these are all very worrisome problems. And to the extent that people who are support of following legal process are in charge, I think we have a right to be hopeful. To me, the key thing is getting this voting rights legislation through and to preempt these anti-democratic state laws which prevent poor people and young people from voting who would otherwise be voting for the Democratic Party. That's the real problem. And getting that federal legislation passed is critically important.
Well, Michael Greenberger, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
You're welcome.
And again, I've been speaking with Michael Greenberger, who's the former director of the Division of Trading and Markets at the Commodity Future Trading Commission. He's currently the director of the Center for Health and Homeland Security at the University of Maryland, where he also teaches constitutional law at the University of Maryland School of Law. And I've been speaking with Michael Greenberger, who was formerly the Principal Deputy Associate Attorney General at the United States Department of Justice, where he also supervised work on security matters. He's the founder and director of the Center for Health and Homeland Security at the University of Maryland, where he also teaches constitutional law at the University of Maryland